Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Off the Podium. I have Christopher Theofanidis with me. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tigran. Great to be here with you.
That's a perfect pronunciation of my name.
Good. Yeah, I'm very sensitive to these things, actually. You know,
So
my first name, my legal first name is Vasilis, which is Greek, and Theofanidis. And growing up in Texas, you can't imagine the chaos of that pronunciation. So,
yeah, and I was going to ask you about your last name. So I'm assuming you're first generation or second generation.
Yeah, my father was born in Greece. Actually, he was born in Samos and grew up in Athens. And yeah, so and I still have a half sister who lives there with her family. So it's a kind of still a strong connection.
Wow. Going back and talking about this specific moment in history, with everything happening with COVID-19 and lots of cancellation, you're a professor and you're active as a composer. You know, your pieces are performed all over the world. What have you been doing for the past 3 or 4 months now in dealing with this current moment?
Right. Thanks for the question. Everybody's on hold. I mean, you suddenly realize how contingent your life is on events and planning and things like that. And so when early on when things started to shut down, I came down to be near family, near my mother and my brother and his family here in Houston, which is where I grew up. So it's kind of a strange thing to return home for the first real length of time. I mean, other than visits in over 30 years. So that's been kind of an interesting thing. So I left Connecticut, but I still have my things up there, and plan to return when school opens up. And as of today, June, whatever it is, 25th, we still don't know exactly how the fall will look as a kind of academic year. So I've been down here and I've been doing some writing. It's not been coming very easily. It's not a steady kind of process as it has been in the past. But taking in other things as I can, a lot of poetry, a lot of short stories, trying to learn some Spanish, some other kinds of projects to keep things coming in that are positive.
Yeah. One thing that I've realized in talking to all these amazing inspirational artists throughout my podcast, over 100 episodes, is that I hear this a lot, is people who have done so much in their career say, I'm learning this other thing. And it's so great to hear that someone who is so accomplished is still learning or trying to learn some other language. I had Rand Blake, who's from New England Conservatory. He was telling me how he's learning math because he's been passionate about math and he's learning that. What inspires you to keep doing that? Is it just wanting to learn, or what is it?
I think, it may be really obvious thing to say, but if you're just putting out what there's no fuel. I mean, it's just, you're kind of treading water in a way. And I always felt in some way that, the thing I always struggled with prior to this period is just having time to learn the things I'm interested in learning, and spending more than, 15 or 20 minutes looking into something, or, and so having this actually as a period where I have some discipline with respect to learning something else has been a great thing in some ways, despite the situation. And I think that phrase, beginner's mind, has always been like in my thinking, that you can't be afraid to start from scratch, from nothing, and to learn something from that point of view, because you make a lot of mistakes and you seem stupid to yourself in ways that you're not used to. But I think if you do that enough times, it builds a kind of way of being that's really nice. So
with composers, especially you've composed so many different pieces, from maybe 2 flutes to full orchestra and choirs and everything. If there's someone who's listening to the podcast who has never heard any of your pieces, what's one piece that you would recommend for that person to listen to?
Oh, well, thanks for asking that question. The piece that I think probably most people have heard, if they've heard of me at all, is the piece Rainbow Body, because that is kind of a shorter piece that I wrote in 1999 and 2000, and it's been performed quite a bit. So, that might be a good place to start. I mean, for the large scale works, maybe the Here and Now and my first symphony, are the 2 other pieces I would say. And then the chamber works, which are very different kind of in feeling. Ariel Ascending is a string quartet that I wrote early on, and a more recent piano quintet called At the Still Point. So that collection of pieces are kind of have a little bit bigger picture of me in a way than just the Rainbow Body piece.
Yeah. The first piece I heard of yours was actually Rainbow Body years ago, and that was my introduction to your music. So it's a great place to start. One thing that I love asking composers is their mindset about composing. Some composers like where they're commissioned and they're told, I want you to write a piece that's about 15 minutes long. It's for choir and soloists or orchestra or 4 flutes and 2 clarinets or whatever it might be, and others, they just like the freedom of doing whatever they want. What's your approach, and how do you like to work?
Well, one of the things that I think happens is if different ensembles approach you, they almost always have something in mind. They want a 10-minute concert opener. They want something that opens a new hall. They have an unusual instrumentation on this particular concert. So you often come to you with that kind of prescription in a way. But it does happen sometimes when you build up trust with a conductor, especially over time. You get the question, what would you like to write? And that's my favorite, of course, because then you can dream a little bit. But honestly, I would say that when people come to you and they ask you, okay, let's do a piccolo concerto or something like that, I start seeing possibilities. I mean, I don't think of those as restrictions. I think, well, okay, this is the material that I have to work with. How can I think of this creatively? How can I think of this that would give it something personal, unusual? So those things actually never quite feel like somebody's giving you a set of rules, but just, this is the world you're going to live in for this piece. Let's see what magic we can make,
With orchestras, specifically for orchestras, it seems like, well, you're an exception. There's some other composers who could do bigger pieces, but for the most part, for some reason, it's just a concert opener, a 15-minute piece, a 10-minute piece. What can orchestras or individuals or arts administrators do or to promote new music a little bit more? I mean, it's being promoted, but a little bit more than just a concert opener, maybe a concerto, maybe an actual symphony. What can they do? Is there something they can do? Have you thought about this?
I've observed a lot of people in action in different kinds of ways. And, the 2 people who come to mind are 2 people I know very well, Robert Spano and David Allen Miller in Albany Symphony. And both of them have something in common, which is they actually cultivate a kind of longer term, building of the idea that this is vital and kind of a thing. And they also aren't afraid to put it out front. I think one of the things that's happened for a couple of decades especially is that when people do new music, it's kind of apologetically put out there, and I think if in some ways both of those conductors have really made an effort to say, look, this is new, isn't this great? Well, let's see what happens when we do this. And they make it a primary part of the event. And they do also very clever and creative things, like with the Atlanta Symphony. Robert has a series of interviews where he's just talking informally with the composer, that maybe 3 minutes prior to the piece, and they show it on both screens, and then they play the piece. Immediately, that helps with people's receptivity and making it something. He's also made quite an effort to record pieces and things, which helps too. I mean, the Rainbow Body probably would not have had nearly any of the amount of exposure that it had it not been for that recording that Atlanta did. Mm-hmm. And it made a lot of other things possible for me for that. So recording, which is not something that's so common these days. I mean, some people are doing live recording, which is great. But that's another way to kind of keep it, to archive it.
Yeah. And one thing, as you mentioned, one thing that I really appreciate about some of the conductors and organizations is that they're able to perform that new piece a couple of times. Because if you're introduced to something, if, for example, a baby, I always think about this because I have a 10-month-old, and you give them something to eat, and they might not initially like it so much. They're like, they're not used to the texture or something, but then, doctors recommend you try it a couple of times and maybe they'll actually get used to it. And that's what I think about new music, is that sometimes you might not enjoy it the first time, or you might not be used to certain sounds or other things that the composer is introducing, but you hear it a couple of times and it becomes, a little bit more close to your heart, to your mind. So I do really appreciate conductors that and organizations that bring back the piece a couple of times and really let audiences to think about it more. And recordings are a really great way to do it too, even though, as you mentioned, it's not happening as often now. I wanted to know, with accomplished people, we know so much about their life specific to music or arts, whatever they're doing, but we don't know much about other personal things. What's something, a hobby, something unusual that you do that many of your followers and fans don't know that you're willing to share with us?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. I will have a list of things for you in a second. I was just thinking, though, that the idea of repeating a piece or doing it again is really important for a number of reasons too. That if the conductor also does it a second time, they have a different relationship to it and a different kind of commitment to it in a weird way. And it breathes differently. So I heard now Rainbow Body with Robert conducting for 20 years. I've heard him done it a lot of times, and it's really neat now to think about that first performance with Houston Symphony, and then the most recent performance in Atlanta that he did. And also, I think a lot of conductors tour with these pieces. If they're guest conduct, sometimes they'll program it at other places. They'll do it once with their home orchestra, and then they'll see how it reads if they're on the road. And that's another way that these things kind of get spread around, is when the conductors who maybe make the piece possible take it to another orchestra, take it to another, or for chamber music, same thing, when they take it out and try it around. It becomes, the relationship to the piece becomes different, and the piece becomes hopefully more meaningful, and so anyway, but to return to the hobbies, the personal things, I'll tell you, I'll work backwards, which is right now, it's been maybe, 15 years since I cooked seriously.
Wow.
I mean, I did one a long time ago but it's been a long time. And so in this period, one of the things I do is every day, actually, I cook something that requires some pretty serious effort. And that's been really neat. I mean, it's something I really look forward to. I don't think of it in terms of a time problem. I just kind of plan around it. Okay, this is going to take about an hour and a half. I'm in, whatever it is. And so that's been a real pleasure for me. And, and figuring out what my own tastes are when I see the recipe and I think, well, this came out, but it was a little too much marjoram or too much thyme or something like that. Then I understand my relationship to the ingredients in the same way that I think one probably does in composition or whatever, or your tastes. You have to try them out a lot to understand what they are. So I really enjoyed this period for cooking quite a bit. In the past, I've had some things which have been particular to periods of my life. There was a period where I did a lot of scuba diving, which I really enjoyed a lot. And, I also associate it with, it's kind of like a social thing, because my closest friend and I would go to these places together and dive, make a trip out of the several dives that we would do. And then the other things that came around that created the environment that was really neat. So that's another one. I mean, I love taking hikes. One of the pleasures for me every year in teaching out at Aspen Music Festival is that environment. It's just taking hikes a couple times a week in really interesting places and so beautiful, and taking that in. So I've traveled also around quite a bit. I mean, this night sky here, I've traveled around for night skies. Like I've been to a couple of dark sky preserves and really enjoy making road trips that take me into that kind of environment that allows me to kind of look up and feel small and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. You're not the first composer on this podcast to say that you enjoy cooking. I had Robert Aldridge, who's a composer, and he talked a lot about how he cooks and he really enjoys that process. It is very similar. I'm not a composer, but I really want to get into cooking, but for some reason I just haven't found the right thing for me to do yet. I'm kind of there helping out a little bit with the cooking, but not really my thing yet. Hopefully in the future.
One of the ways I found into cooking, which was kind of interesting, is because I got so overwhelmed. There's so many recipes and so many things that you can learn, knife technique and this, that, and the other thing. But I started to think, well, I'll build a plate around one ingredient, like beets. or fennel or something like that. And then I'll look up a bunch of recipes and see which one appeals me to try. And it helps me kind of focus my mind a little bit. It's like the prescription of the instrumentation of the orchestra. Like you start with a beat and then you find something, interesting to kind of build around. And I found that to be a really helpful way into cooking in a way, because it gives me a smaller field to kind of evaluate what seems like would be interesting.
Well, you spoke a little bit about a couple of conductors that you've closely worked with for a long time, but then there's also the collaboration with Sarah Chang, who premiered your violin concerto. What's the process like to work with? And maybe you've had different stories, different experiences, but what's the process like? How much does a soloist want to be involved in giving advice on what should be done on the instrument, and how much do you just kind of put it out there and just stick with whatever you have and challenge the soloist?
Yeah, this is a really interesting avenue of kind of talking, because, well, every soloist I've ever worked with has wanted to be very involved in the process, actually. I think because they're so invested in it, they really want it to feel like a nice suit or a nice whatever, clothing that's tailored for them. So, sometimes that's a little bit. I mean, usually it's, some moderate amount at least of communication back and forth, and sometimes it's very involved. And with Sarah, it was extremely involved. I mean, she was really in there, and we were communicating back and forth a ton. And I mean, I laughed when I actually, most of our communications were remote for a while, and then we met in person, and she showed me her part, and it was like 10 colors. Oh, I mean, I couldn't even read the notes. There were so many details on there. It was startling. I took a picture of it. Actually, it's incredible. So yeah, I mean, I think that the level, but people always want to be interested in that. And by the way, going back to conducting for a second, this is something that Robert Spano has done at Atlanta, which I appreciate a lot. It was also part of my early experience as a composer with the orchestra, is a kind of workshop for a new piece for orchestra. Not just going straight into the week of the rehearsal and the performance, but sometime earlier in the season, if there's a light week or a light period where they can dedicate 45 minutes to a reading of a new work in progress, it's incredibly useful. And then the players and also the conductor are a little bit more invested in the project in the way that a soloist is for a concerto. But I also think that, concerto is something very personal. I mean, it's most of the time the people who ask you to do a piece can often be your friends. I know Martin Kuskman, is my wonderful friend. And so they feel like personal pieces in an interesting way. And I remember Joan Tower once saying that she for a while she had given up writing orchestra pieces, but still would write concertos, because she felt that orchestra pieces became a little bit impersonal for her. Like, she would show up for the rehearsals, she'd meet with the orchestra, but she wouldn't they'd all go home at the end of the rehearsal, and she was left kind of alone on her own, and it became kind of an impersonal experience for her. But these concertos, they have a different kind of feeling also for her, and I think kept her alive in that world for a while.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned, I have to thank Martin for introducing us and connecting us, because I had such a great time talking to him. And I've been fortunate. I've had so many guests. All my guests have been so wonderful. And for some reason, even though many of them I have never met, it seems like an actual natural conversation of people that seems like I've met before. And
Right.
He's amazing, and I hope to have him back in the future. It's always something to talk about with him.
Yeah, and he was actually somebody, the bassoon concerto that I wrote for him, I think it was the second concerto that I wrote. He was very involved. We were sending at that point faxes. This was back in the 90s, and he would his universal comment was, "This is too easy, more difficult. You got to do it harder." Yeah. And so I took delight in kind of trying to figure out what made something technically tricky, or, he circular breathes. So he was like, how long can this passage go on? So I said, you realize, Martin, you're right. Yeah, I'm writing you a piece that nobody else will ever be able to do but you. I think he took some pride in that.
That's awesome. I always appreciate, and he's really, as a bassoon player, just a rock star. I mean, you hear his playing. And I remember when I was going to have him on the podcast, I told a couple of my bassoonist friends, and I was like, "Hey, do you know this name?" And a couple of them responded, they're like, "Of course I know. He's a rock star bassoon player." So
Yeah.
it's really great. Since you're an educator, and I'm sure you do this all the time in your teaching or advice to especially graduate students, but what advice would you give to young musicians who are, maybe struggling with a career or just leaving college and trying to put it together? And, it's not that easy in this world, being an artist, a composer. What advice would you give to young musicians, composers maybe?
Yeah, that's a really good, and especially now it's so hard to know how to advise people just getting started out in this particular moment, and to have faith in the field. But I think no matter how the field unfolds, or I think that the thing that you ultimately end up believing in is the power of human creativity and a belief in some kind of beauty or transcendence or struggle or something that you represent in this funny mode of music or art or poetry or drama or something like that. That's the fundamental belief, and the circumstances will change around that. So first, to feel confident in that eternal sense of what we do, and then the other two things, I guess one of them was what I related to you earlier about taking things in always, and also being a really active observer, because in the end, if you like marjoram or thyme because you tried it, you tasted this thing. And I think you have to be able to, when you're listening to something, if something works or doesn't work, you have to say, it didn't work. But the interesting thing, because it didn't work, the reason why is because of this. And then something, some knowledge for your craft, for your thing. And so that observational sense, you have to cultivate that. That's really important. I think it's maybe the most important thing for that. The other thing, I think in terms of, having some kind of long-term sense that you'll make it is important. It's, and I heard one artist say this once, a writer, she said that, you have to protect your time, really, because the hardest thing is to have the mental coherence to actually do your art. And it's harder and harder the more fragmented we become, the more distracted we become, the more anxiety we have about the COVID or whatever. It's harder to have the mental coherence and focus. So the thing to try to protect, I think, if you can, and it's hard, it's a struggle, is that block of time that's you can somehow keep everything else out, and it's you and the art, because that's real. That's the thing that's the most real. Everything else comes and goes. So yeah, maybe those couple of points.
Yeah, going back to your works, obviously Rainbow Body has been performed hundreds of times around the world, around the country. Thinking about some of your lesser performed works, what's one of those pieces that you really wish had more performances than it has over the past years?
Yeah. Well, the two chamber pieces that I mentioned, Ariel Ascending and At the Still Point, are difficult. And I wish those pieces were performed more, but it takes a kind of committed group to make those pieces happen, I would say. I have other pieces. I think the things, the ones you kind of wish were out there were the ones you really tried hard on and you feel like you got right, but they're not easy to put together, They take a little bit more effort. And so in the orchestral world, one of those pieces for me is the symphony. It's a hard piece to put together. It's a big piece, like 35 minutes. The other one is a big oratorio that I wrote called Creation Creator. And there's also one called The Refuge, both of which, because of the scale of them, don't get done a lot, but I like the message behind them in a way. And I hope one day maybe they will be performed again and, by different groups and that kind of thing. But it's their commitments, I think that there is a virtue to writing a 7-minute piece for that reason, is that, that can be done. So maybe those couple of pieces in particular.
Yeah. And sometimes from an orchestra, specifically orchestra perspective, it's a little bit different, I think, with quartets or quintets. But orchestra, they have limited time for rehearsals, and putting the piece together. So sometimes when you see a tough piece, you're like, well, we're going to have this much time. How are we going to put this massive thing together? So sometimes people avoid those, but hopefully that will change as well. Hopefully orchestras will give more time to putting a piece together, but it's also tough because you want to use 2 weeks to just have one performance where you're trying to make money. And so there's just so much to think about the orchestra world and everything, it's tough. But I do have another question specific to collaborations, and you've had long-standing collaborations with Robert Spano and other musicians, but what's a collaboration that you've had in the back of your mind that, maybe with a specific artist that you've already worked with, maybe with an artist that you've never worked with, and you really want to collaborate with them, right, for that quartet or for that orchestra or for that singer? It's in the back of your mind. You want to do it, whether it's going back working with them again or just a completely new person or new organization.
That's a nice question. Well, there are two, actually. One is going to happen, but the other one is... there's a video installation artist who I admire a great deal named Bill Viola. And for some strange reason, I've come across retrospectives of his work whenever I've traveled in the most far-flung places around the planet. And I stumble into them. I don't even intend to go see them. And so he's been in my mind for a very long time, for decades, actually. And I had a chance to write a string quartet for the Miro Quartet, responding to one of his magnum opus, his really large work. And I did that. I'd never met him, but we had some back and forth through his people and that kind of thing. And he's somebody I would genuinely love to figure out a way to work with, even though in some ways we're kind of in different universes aesthetically. But I so admire what he does that I think the process actually would be an incredible thing, just to see what would happen if you try. What happens when you go in with an open mind and heart and you have these conversations about middle ground, what would come out. So that's one thing. The other one is a project that I'm working on now with two collaborators. It's I don't know if you know the story of Hermann Hesse called Siddhartha, which is about the Buddha. And it's a very particular way of telling the Buddha story through the sense of rejection of everything until you find your own voice. And it's a really beautiful story and kind of very calm, still story. In a way, it's perfect for this moment in time, I think. This is a project that it's been in my horizon for probably 15 or 20 years. And I think it's finally going to happen. And it's as an oratorio with some wonderful performers. And, Robert, I think, is committed to conducting it, which is great. And I have one of my close friends who's a poet, Melissa Studdard, is doing the libretto. And an old friend of mine, Ann Patterson, is doing design and production for this. Robert has this idea of that he's been doing for a long time called theater of the concert, and turning concert experiences into has to have some dimensionality of theater in them. And so that's the project that I'm really, because it's already borne a lot of fruit in terms of like the conversations we've had about it and so forth. And I think that's going to be very rich collaboration.
Wow. That's amazing. And I think collaborations with other genres, other artists has always been a part of it, but it's great to see that it's happening more and more with artists trying to collaborate. And there doesn't have to be a set formula of a way to do it. It's just great to get some great minds from different art forms come together and really try to build something from nothing. Almost seems like when I think of bands, I had some friends in high school that played in bands, and they're like, well, we get together and we write a song. I would ask them, who writes the songs, who writes the music? Like, well, we get together and we kind of just do it.
Yeah.
And so it's great to think of it that way. One thing I really appreciate and love about what you're doing is that with some composers, when you listen to their music, you're like, well, I know who that composer is. Well, with your music, and this is a compliment. When I listen to your music, sometimes I'll listen to a piece and I'll say, wow, is this really is this really his piece? And it's sort of different than your other pieces. How do you manage to come to a different place where it's, you know, it's a great thing because you're really able to offer something unique than you've done the previous time, but how do you manage to do that? It's kind of a tough thing to do, right, as a composer?
Well, thank you for that comment. First of all, a couple of things. One, I think you can't be so self-aware of your the way you are all the time. I mean, in a way, you know, but I would say more importantly is, I mean, I think anybody, if you ask them, you know, does Stravinsky work? Does Brahms work? Yes, they work. They sound quite fantastic, both of them. You know, why? You see that music can work in this way and in this way. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to only be this, you know? And I think for me, it's part of the joy of understanding, you know, how things can stretch. And yes, I mean, I have a core kind of identity in some way about time and, you know, and metabolism and things like that, and maybe orchestral sound, or, you know, certain kinds of things remain. But I'm delighted if I can find some way, like, oh, look, this works too. You know, I like that feeling a lot. And I mean, I think also as a teacher, you see how many ways that music can work through your students, because you see them and you're like, oh, wow, that's a very original. And then you look over here, oh, that's amazing. She's incredible. You know, and then you get the whole field and you say, all these ways are really valid, beautiful ways, and they work on their own terms. And so I think that empowers you ultimately. You know, I mean, the question, I think, sometimes is a matter of people's personal taste too. So, you know, if you know, somebody might say, you know, why, like the piece that I did called Creation Creator has a lot of different stylistic things going on, and I think for some people it was a little bit disorienting, you know, that this was going on in the same piece. I mean, it's a big oratorio, but for me it felt very freeing, you know. I mean, I felt that way, and so it was a reflection of my my delight in many things, you know. Normally those are not all in the same piece, they're kind of here and there and try different things. But yeah, I mean, it's a really a personal thing, but I'm glad if you feel that way, because I actually I feel that way too when I'm writing, you know, that it feels that way. So
one standard question that has kind of come back and throughout my podcast is life-changing moments, and I'd like to know too, if you're willing to share. One is a life-changing moment in your professional musical career, and a life-changing moment in your personal life, if you're willing to share that with us.
Life-changing moment in each of those ways, boy. The life-changing moments that are more mundane, actually, and there's the ones that are cataclysmic philosophically. Let's say, you know, from the mundane perspective, I mean, I think, you know, I remember one time I walked into a rehearsal with Robert Spano, and he was conducting this piece based on Rumi poetry that I wrote, and he did the first movement, which is unaccompanied choir, sounded very nice. Second movement he started, and it was completely chaotic, and I was so distraught. I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to fix this. I have to remove the horns. I need to add this here. I need to do all this kind of thing. It's a million decisions in my life to make this thing work, and it's going to still not sound good. And he stopped and he said, Chris, wait. Everybody in the orchestra played piano. And suddenly it was incredibly, like everything sounded really good. Oh. And that might sound like a very mundane thing to say, but it really calmed me down for the way I think about problems, actually, in some way. Is like, take a step back, you know, is there may be a very easy fix or solution to something that seems very complicated if you look at it to focus like this. And so that both, it was a mundane and ridiculous moment in some way, but it actually had some impact, not only on my musical thinking, but also in my personal life, actually, as a kind of a thing. I mean, I don't know, you know, it's too bad I can't think about this a little bit, because there are so many different kind of things, you know, that one could say that are kind of life-changing, I think.
No, that's great. I love that, and that's actually great advice. I'm learning from this as well. I do want to know, mentors and inspirational figures are such a big and important part of our lives. Who were some of your mentors or inspirational people in your life, whether they're musicians or composers or just people, family, or
Yeah.
friends?
Yeah. Well, family, my mom is somebody who's been, just like a rock for my whole life. It's just been an amazing thing. There's a guy to whom Rainbow Buddy is dedicated, actually. His name is Glenn Rosenbaum, and he's a very close friend of our family, and I've known him since I was very young. And his character is something that I think really influenced me. He is probably the most gracious person I know. He never does things. He does everything very easily, and I really appreciate that sensibility. Nothing is a problem for him, and it's. I mean, it sounds like a funny thing to say, but the way he approaches anything that comes at him is with some kind of grace. I appreciate that a lot. And so he's been somebody who I think I've looked at. Robert, for 1,000 reasons, Robert Spano, he's some kind of incredible person as a human being too. I mean, he has such unusual interests personally. Like I came into his house once and he had this gigantic book like this sitting in there, and it was all handwritten. I said, Robert, what is this? He said, oh, I'm studying the number 3. I was like, what? It's incredible. And so this is like very self-motivated human being to understand archetypes and, things like that are just not your typical person in some way, and not the typical way of thinking about things. So from that perspective, the way he follows his own muse, in a way, he's into listening to his own interests very attentively, and what has flavor and texture for him, he takes very far in his own personal life. That's been an influence for me for sure.
And I've enjoyed your conversations with him as well. Leading up to this, I watched quite a few of them on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Your interviews with him. So
great, thanks.
Yeah. So last question. I mean, what do you listen to outside of classical music, or outside of what you perform, and what the recordings that maybe you're listening to your own recordings if you do that? But what do you listen to? What are some of the last pieces that you've...
I have a lot of my personal tastes. I mean, if you're going to describe them, you might describe them as two separate people. So in the way that you were saying about some of the pieces, that in my heart, flamenco music especially, and Indian Hindustani music especially, and Qawwali music from Pakistan. These are music which are very close to my heart. I love them. I listen to them in the background. This is something that I move to. And then on the other hand, I love Renaissance music and things which are quite contained and kind of have a certain austerity to them, and I find a lot of beauty in that too. So there's kind of two sides of the personality in a way I find a lot of comfort in those musics in particular. I listen to a lot of Balkan music. This is music which means a lot to me too. So, of course, I listen to a lot of things too when I go to concerts and things like that. I've taken a lot of things with great pleasure. But I think if you ask me what I turn on when nobody's around, it would be one of those musics.
Wow. That's beautiful. Well, anything else you want to add before we end today?
Oh, no, thank you. But thanks very much for the time and the interview and the interest. It's very nice to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me. And I hope one of these days we could do this in person, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you to you, Tigran. Have a wonderful ride or walk today when you go out.
Thank you. Take care.
See you.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Off the Podium. If you enjoyed this episode, please comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.